They flew into the rising sun, believing they were invisible, guided by faith, not technology. The kamikaze squadrons were Japan's final weapon, young men sworn to die with honor rather than face defeat. But on that fateful morning, something happened that shattered their certainty. Miles before they reached the fleet, Allied radar screens began to glow, tiny green dots moving across the glass like ghosts. The operators stared in disbelief. These planes weren't supposed to be visible. Kamikazes were meant to strike unseen, unstoppable. Yet here they were, already exposed, already doomed. As sirens wailed across the Pacific and anti-aircraft guns turned toward the sky, the men who believed they carried the Emperor's divine wind realized a terrifying truth: they were no longer invisible. For the first time, the hunters had become the hunted. And death was waiting, long before they ever arrived. By 1944, Japan stood on the edge of collapse. The Pacific was burning, the empire shrinking, and the once invincible navy lay in ruins. Yet from the ashes of defeat rose a new weapon, not built of steel, but of flesh and faith. The kamikaze pilots, the divine wind, were young men trained to turn their planes into missiles, their bodies into bombs. To the world, they were fanatics. But to Japan, they were saviors, the last hope to halt the unstoppable Allied advance. Each flight was a one-way mission, blessed by priests and fueled by prayers. Every takeoff meant goodbye. What they didn't know was that across the ocean, the Allies had built something equally powerful, a machine that could see death coming before it arrived. Radar. Silent, unseen, and watching. When those green screens began to light up with the approach of Japan's final weapon, a new kind of war began, one fought not with swords or courage, but with electricity and fear. Long before their engines roared across the Pacific, the kamikaze pilots were bound by something far stronger than metal or fuel, an unbreakable code of sacrifice. In the final years of World War II, when Japan's defeat became inevitable, its leaders turned to the one resource they still possessed in abundance: the unwavering devotion of their youth. These were not seasoned veterans hardened by battle. Most were barely out of school, teenagers with soft hands and trembling hearts who had grown up under an empire that worshipped death as the highest honor. From childhood, they were taught that dying for the emperor was not a tragedy, but a destiny. Training for the kamikaze was brief and brutal. The young men learned how to fly, but not how to land. They practiced dives over the sea, memorizing the maneuvers that would carry them straight into enemy ships. In their pockets, they carried family photos, letters they would never send, and small white headbands marked with a single red circle, the rising sun they would never see again. Before each mission, they gathered in quiet airfields lined with cherry blossoms. Shinto priests offered blessings. Officers handed them ceremonial cups of sake, a toast to eternity. There was no fear in their eyes, only a strange calm, as if death had already accepted them. To many in Japan, these men were divine, the emperor's thunder, human bombs meant to strike terror into the hearts of the enemy. But behind the honor and propaganda, there were whispers. Some pilots confessed to comrades that they did not want to die. Some cried in silence the night before takeoff, their hands shaking as they wrote their final words. Yet when the moment came, they climbed into their cockpits, strapped themselves in, and took off into the sky, not for victory, but for meaning. The sound of their engines was not a roar of triumph, but a requiem for a generation sacrificed to pride. In their hearts, they believed the Americans could never see them coming. They believed their deaths would be swift and unseen, guided by the gods themselves. But in the dark corners of the Pacific, far beyond their knowledge, machines were listening, and soon, the divine wind would meet something it could not outrun. Thousands of miles away from Japan, inside dimly lit bunkers and steel command ships, another kind of soldier prepared for battle. They weren't pilots or gunners. They didn't carry rifles or wear medals. They were radar operators, men who fought the war not with bullets, but with flickering lights on a glass screen. To most of the world, radar was still a mystery. It was invisible, silent, almost magical. Waves of radio energy pulsed across the skies, bouncing off metal wings miles away, revealing what human eyes could not yet see. To the men who operated these machines, every blip on the screen represented life or death, a friend, an enemy, or the moment before an explosion. In the early months of 1945, as Allied fleets closed in on Okinawa, the radar rooms became the heart of every operation. Operators worked in silence, their faces lit only by the green glow of cathode tubes. Cigarette smoke hung in the air, the low hum of electricity filling the room. Then, suddenly, the screens would come alive, dots multiplying, moving information, approaching fast. At first, the men thought it was a glitch. The weather, perhaps. Birds. But as the signals grew stronger, the truth became impossible to deny. Dozens, then hundreds, of aircraft were approaching. And they were not returning to Japan. Through the static of the radio came urgent voices. Reports confirmed it, unidentified planes diving from the east, moving low and fast. Orders spread like fire through the fleet. Anti-aircraft crews scrambled, pilots sprinted to their planes, sirens screamed across the decks. The operators could hear it all, the chaos they had just predicted. And yet, they never left their posts. Their mission was to see, to warn, to watch. Every movement on the radar was a heartbeat closer to disaster. What made it more terrifying was that these planes weren't flying like any others. They didn't turn back. They didn't break formation. They kept coming, locked on their path, as if death itself was steering their course. In that moment, the men behind the radar realized they weren't witnessing a simple air raid, they were staring into a storm of human sacrifice. A wave of pilots who didn't want to survive. And the most chilling part? The radar had seen them long before the sky did. The first wave appeared like shadows rising from the horizon. To the men on the decks of the Allied ships, they looked almost peaceful, silver dots glinting against the morning sun, flying low over the waves. But peace lasted only seconds. The sirens blared, and the tranquil sea erupted into chaos. Enemy aircraft inbound. Multiple contacts, the voices screamed over the radios. The men who had just been eating breakfast threw themselves toward their battle stations. The air shuddered with the growl of engines and the shriek of flak cannons. The radar blips had become real, the kamikazes were here. From the cockpits of their Zero fighters, the Japanese pilots could already see the white wakes of Allied ships slicing through the ocean. Their hearts pounded. Some prayed. Some whispered the names of mothers, lovers, or gods. They had been told that one man, one plane, could destroy a ship, that their deaths would ignite Japan's rebirth. Now, there was no turning back. Inside the Allied command centers, chaos and discipline collided. Officers barked orders as the radar operators tracked the incoming waves. Bearing 082. Altitude 2000. Speed increasing. Every few seconds, a new cluster appeared on the screens, dozens of aircraft plunging toward the fleet. And then, the first impact. A kamikaze broke through the anti-aircraft fire, its fuselage already burning. The pilot never flinched. He dove straight into the side of the destroyer USS Laffey. The explosion tore through steel and men alike. The blast was so powerful that debris rained across the decks of nearby ships. Yet even as smoke billowed and alarms screamed, more dots appeared on the radar, more pilots, more fire, more death on the way. In the skies, it was madness. American fighters scrambled to intercept, weaving through tracer fire, trying desperately to stop the suicide dives before they hit. Pilots shouted warnings over the radio, sometimes too late. He's coming down. He's coming straight for us. The sky turned into a battlefield of smoke and courage, where every decision lasted no more than a heartbeat. Down below, sailors watched in horror as one kamikaze after another plunged from the heavens. Some missed, crashing into the sea in pillars of steam. Others struck dead on, tearing through flight decks, detonating fuel lines, turning metal into fire. For the radar crews, the horror was different. They saw it all before anyone else did. Each new blip was a heartbeat, each cluster a prophecy of destruction. They could only watch and call out coordinates, their voices trembling as the screens filled with chaos. It was like watching fate unfold in green light. But even amid the destruction, there were moments of eerie beauty, fragments of humanity shining through the storm. One operator later recalled how, for a brief second before impact, he saw a kamikaze pilot's face through binoculars. He wasn't screaming, he said softly. He looked calm. Like he'd already made peace with everything. By sunset, the waves were littered with burning wreckage, fragments of planes, oil, bodies, and silence. The radar stations that had pulsed with light all day now flickered faintly, like dying stars. The battle had ended, but the images would haunt every man who survived it. The kamikaze attacks were devastating. More than 3,800 pilots gave their lives in these suicide missions, sinking dozens of ships and killing thousands of sailors. Yet, in a tragic twist of fate, their very determination exposed them. Their formations, their predictability, their refusal to turn back, all made them perfect targets for radar detection. Technology had turned the tide. The divine wind that once destroyed invaders centuries ago had met a new enemy, science. The invisible had become visible. And in that realization, something shifted forever. Warfare was no longer just about courage or sacrifice. It had become a battle between faith and electricity, between the unseen spirits of devotion and the cold precision of machines. The kamikazes had sought immortality through death, but what they found instead was a new kind of invisibility, one that radar could trace, and history could never forget. As the smoke cleared and the sea began to swallow the wreckage, a haunting silence fell over the Pacific. But for those who listened closely, echoes still floated through the air, the final transmissions of the kamikaze pilots, fragments of voices carried by static across dying radios. Japanese ground stations had recorded many of these farewell messages. They weren't battle cries, they were confessions whispered into eternity. "Mother, I am leaving now," one voice said softly, his tone trembling between pride and fear. Another pilot simply murmured, "I will see you beyond the clouds." Some sang as they dived, reciting ancient poems written by samurai before battle, verses about cherry blossoms falling at the height of their beauty, dying young, dying perfect. Each kamikaze carried a letter, written before takeoff, sealed in a small wooden box to be delivered home after their mission. Those letters, decades later, revealed the truth that propaganda had hidden. Many pilots didn't believe in the emperor's divinity. They didn't dream of glory. They longed for peace, and for the simple lives they'd never live. One pilot wrote, "If I could be born again, I would like to be a farmer. I would like to grow something instead of destroy it." Another admitted, "I do not fear death. I fear only that my death will change nothing." Their commanders had promised them immortality, that dying for Japan would make them eternal. But in those final moments, as flames licked the wings and the ocean rose to meet them, immortality felt distant. What they really wanted was forgiveness, from their families, from their enemies, and from the world itself. Allied radio operators, too, sometimes caught fragments of these transmissions. One American seaman recalled hearing a faint voice in Japanese moments before impact, calm, steady, almost serene. "He wasn't cursing us," the man said later. "He was saying goodbye." In the days after the attacks, search teams found pieces of wreckage and bodies washed ashore. Among them were photographs of loved ones, good luck charms, and diaries filled with ink-stained words, human evidence of a war that demanded gods but consumed boys. Those diaries became Japan's unspoken ghosts. For years, they were hidden from public view, too painful for families, too shameful for the nation. Yet today, they serve as the most powerful reminder that behind every kamikaze dive was a human heartbeat, young, scared, and painfully alive until the very last second. The voices from the sky did not belong to monsters or heroes. They belonged to sons. To dreamers. To the lost generation that vanished into the clouds, believing their sacrifice would be remembered forever. And though their planes were consumed by fire, their words still drift across time, fragile, heartbreaking proof that even in the final moments of madness, humanity still spoke. When the echoes of explosions faded and the sea fell quiet, the men who had survived returned to their posts, staring at the same glowing screens that had foretold death. For the radar operators, the war was never over. Their job had been to detect the unseen, to predict destruction before it arrived. But no training could prepare them for the weight of what they had witnessed. Some had watched hundreds of blips move toward the fleet, knowing exactly what those signals meant, men flying to their deaths, deliberately, unflinchingly. Every dot on the radar was a human life ending in real time, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. After the battle, the operators tried to carry on as normal. They cleared the screens, reset the frequencies, logged the data. But the silence in those rooms was unbearable. Many later confessed that they saw the green blips in their dreams for years afterward. They'd wake up sweating, hearing phantom alarms and the faint hum of machines that once pulsed like a heartbeat in the dark. To the sailors who fought on deck, the kamikaze attacks were a terror of noise and fire. But to the men below, inside the steel walls, surrounded by radio waves, it was a war of ghosts. They saw the enemy coming long before anyone else did, and yet they were powerless to stop the inevitable. One operator described it years later: "We weren't fighting pilots. We were watching souls fall from the sky." After the war ended, many radar men never spoke of what they'd seen. Their role had been vital, but it left no medals, no public glory. History remembered the dogfights, the ships, the explosions, but not the men who sat in silence and witnessed the world's first collision between faith and technology. Some visited Japan years later, walking through museums that displayed recovered kamikaze letters. They stood in front of glass cases, reading words written by the very men they once tracked on radar. One operator quietly said, "I thought we were enemies. But I see now, they were just boys doing what they were told, same as us." The radar that had once saved thousands of lives also left behind an invisible scar. It showed that war was no longer just about courage or strength, it was about who could see first, who could listen faster, who could turn faith into a frequency. And for those who lived to see peace return, that knowledge was heavier than any metal. They had seen what technology could reveal, and what humanity could lose. In the flicker of radar light, they had watched an empire die. And in its dying breath, they saw themselves reflected, small, fragile, and haunted by the question that would echo forever. How much of our humanity must we sacrifice, to survive? When the war finally ended and the guns fell silent, the divine wind, kamikaze, had lost its power. The skies that once trembled beneath Japan's desperate fury were calm again, scattered with drifting smoke and the quiet hum of engines returning home. But beneath that calm, something had changed forever. For centuries, warriors believed that honor could make them invisible, that faith could protect them from defeat. The kamikaze pilots carried that belief into the clouds, convinced that their sacrifice would be unseen, unstoppable. Yet in the end, it was not divine power that shaped their fate, but invisible waves of science, radar pulses slicing through the heavens, exposing even the bravest hearts to the cold precision of technology. In that single collision between belief and invention, the old world of war ended. Humanity had crossed a threshold. No longer was courage enough, no longer could faith shield one from what could be detected, measured, and destroyed. The gods of war had become machines, and men, no matter how devoted, could no longer hide from their gaze. The kamikazes did not die in vain, but they did die misunderstood. To the world, they were symbols of fanaticism; to their families, they were victims of impossible loyalty. Yet history remembers them differently now, not as monsters, but as young souls caught between two worlds, the ancient and the modern, the spiritual and the scientific. For every radar pulse that exposed them, there was also a heartbeat that echoed back, proof that behind every aircraft was a man, behind every blip was a story, behind every explosion was a dream that never had the chance to live. And so, when we look at the flickering radar screens preserved in museums today, we don't just see the birth of modern warfare. We see the end of innocence, the moment when human faith met human invention and learned that even the divine wind could be seen. Because in war, as in life, there comes a time when belief alone is no longer enough. And perhaps the greatest tragedy of all is this. The kamikazes didn't lose because they were blind. They lost because, for the first time in history, someone else could finally see them.